Alyssa Turner, a dedicated police captain, stood in front of her mirror, adjusting her uniform with precision. The gold insignia gleamed on her shoulder, a symbol of her hard-earned rank. As one of the few black women in law enforcement, Alyssa was a trailblazer. But that didn't come without challenges. Little did she know her routine day off would turn into a life-altering moment when a fellow officer, blinded by bias, mistook her for a suspect. What happens when the very system she's worked to reform turns against her? How will Alyssa fight to regain her dignity and push for change within the department? This story delves deep into themes of racial profiling, justice, and the strength required to lead a revolution from within. If you're intrigued by Alyssa's journey, drop a comment below with your thoughts and predictions. And don't forget to subscribe for more gripping tales that tackle the complexities of life and society. Hit the bell icon to stay updated. This is just the beginning of an emotional, suspense-filled narrative you won't want to miss. Alyssa Turner stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her police captain's uniform with precision. The navy blue fabric hugged her athletic frame, and the gold insignia on her shoulder reflected the sunlight streaming through the window. It had been over 15 years since she first joined the police force, but each time she saw herself in uniform, she felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders once again. Being a black woman in law enforcement was not a common sight, and reaching the rank of captain made her an anomaly, a trailblazer in many ways. Alyssa took pride in her work, but she was acutely aware of the challenges she had overcome. A black woman in the police force? She had heard that question countless times, from colleagues, superiors, and even the community she served. It wasn't a path paved with ease. She had fought hard to earn her place, not through politics or pulling strings, but through sheer determination, hard work, and intelligence. She had earned the respect of her team, though she knew that even now some still harbored quiet reservations about her position. As she stood in her quiet bedroom, Alyssa allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Today was one of her rare days off, and she intended to make the most of it. David will be thrilled, she thought, her smile growing wider at the thought of her husband. David Turner was her rock, steady, supportive, and always there to ground her when the pressures of her job threatened to overwhelm. Being married to a police officer was no easy task, but David understood her drive, her passion, and the sacrifices that came with it. She quickly shed her uniform, trading it for a pair of casual jeans and a comfortable sweater. Today would be different. No badges, no titles, no responsibilities weighing her down. Just a normal day. As she walked into the kitchen, she could already hear David bustling about, likely preparing breakfast. "You're up early for a day off," David teased as she entered. He was standing by the stove, flipping pancakes, his broad frame relaxed in a way that immediately put Alyssa at ease. He turned to her, his smile warm and welcoming, the smell of butter and maple syrup filling the air. "I figured I'd make the most of it," Alyssa replied, wrapping her arms around him from behind. She inhaled deeply, the familiar scent of his cologne mixing with the aroma of breakfast. "Besides, I wanted to get some errands done before we have the whole day to ourselves." David chuckled softly. "You? Running errands on your day off? I thought you'd want to relax," Alyssa shrugged, moving to pour herself a cup of coffee. "Relaxing comes later. First, I need to restock our groceries. You can't sit still for too long." David raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. He knew her too well. Alyssa was the type of person who thrived on being productive, even on her rare days away from work. It was part of what had drawn him to her, the unstoppable drive, the ambition, the quiet strength beneath her calm exterior. As she finished her coffee and grabbed her keys, David called after her. "Don't work too hard, Alyssa. Remember, this is supposed to be a break." She shot him a playful grin over her shoulder. "I'll be back before you know it." Meanwhile, across town, Officer Brian King was feeling anything but relaxed. He sat in his squad car, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as he stared at the quiet street in front of him. It was a slow day, too slow for his liking. Brian was still relatively new to the force, having joined a few years ago with high hopes of making a difference. But lately it seemed like every shift was the same. Traffic stops, noise complaints, the occasional petty theft. Nothing like the high-stakes action he had imagined when he first put on the badge. Brian sighed heavily, his eyes scanning the area. He wanted more than this. He needed more. He had joined the force to be in the thick of things, to be the kind of cop who made a real impact. But instead, he found himself sitting in a car, waiting for something, anything to happen. He tapped his fingers against the dashboard, the faint hum of the radio barely registering in his mind. As much as he hated to admit it, Brian felt like he was being overlooked. He had good instincts, sharp reflexes, and a hunger to prove himself. But somehow, he was always given the quieter, less eventful assignments, while his colleagues got the action-packed cases. Maybe today will be different, he muttered to himself, though the words felt hollow. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. Barely noon. There was still plenty of time for something exciting to happen. Alyssa strolled through the local grocery store, feeling a rare sense of anonymity as she moved through the aisles. Dressed in casual clothes without her badge or gun, she was just another face in the crowd. She picked out a loaf of fresh bread, some vegetables, and a bottle of wine, already imagining the quiet evening she and David would share later. As she approached the checkout, she overheard snippets of conversation from the cashiers and customers. It was mundane, the small talk of everyday life, and for a brief moment, Alyssa allowed herself to enjoy it. These were the moments she cherished, the moments where she could forget about her responsibilities, her rank, and the weight of her job. After paying for her groceries, Alyssa slung the bag over her shoulder and headed for the exit. The cool autumn air greeted her as she stepped outside, the sky above painted with hues of orange and purple as the day inched closer to dusk. It was peaceful, almost serene, as she began her walk home, the sound of distant traffic humming in the background. Back in his squad car, Brian's radio crackled to life, breaking the monotony of his slow day. Dispatch to all units, we have a 1031 in progress. Robbery suspect, black female, mid-30s, wearing dark jeans and a gray sweatshirt. Last seen heading west on 5th and Maple. Brian's heart rate spiked. Finally. He sat up straighter in his seat, adrenaline surging through his veins. A robbery suspect, and she was nearby. His mind raced as he processed the description. Black female, mid-30s, gray sweatshirt, dark jeans. He could already feel the excitement of being the one to apprehend the suspect, the thrill of making a real difference on his shift. Unit 43, copy that, Brian replied into the radio, gripping the wheel tightly as he made a sharp turn down Maple Street. His eyes scanned the sidewalks, searching for anyone who matched the description. And then he saw her, Alyssa Turner, casually walking down the street, a grocery bag slung over her shoulder, completely unaware of the squad car slowly creeping up behind her. Brian's heart raced as he spotted Alyssa walking down the street. From his vantage point, everything clicked into place. Black female, mid-30s, gray sweatshirt, dark jeans. It was a perfect match. Without hesitation, he pulled over to the curb, his squad car's lights flashing, cutting through the calm evening air. Alyssa, absorbed in her thoughts, didn't immediately register the flashing lights behind her. She had been thinking about dinner with David, imagining the quiet evening they would share, when she suddenly heard a commanding voice ring out. "Ma'am, stop right there!" The tone was sharp, authoritative, and it startled Alyssa. She turned around slowly, confused, blinking against the bright headlights of the police car now pointed directly at her. The officer who stepped out of the car, his hand resting on his belt, was unfamiliar. She squinted, trying to make sense of what was happening. "Is there a problem, officer?" Alyssa asked calmly, though she felt a knot of unease forming in her stomach. This had to be a mistake. She had done nothing wrong, and the situation seemed far more serious than it should have been for someone who had simply been walking home. Brian's eyes narrowed as he approached her. His adrenaline was pumping, and he could feel the weight of his hand on his holstered gun. "Hands where I can see them," he barked. Alyssa frowned, her confusion deepening. "Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm Captain Alyssa Turner. I work with the police department." Her words were calm, and she spoke with the confidence of someone who had been in law enforcement for over a decade. But Brian wasn't listening. In his mind, this was a suspect, someone who fit the description perfectly. He had made up his mind, and now his instincts were telling him to stay in control. "Right," Brian muttered under his breath, his grip tightening. He had heard this kind of excuse before, people pretending to be someone they weren't, lying to get out of trouble. His voice grew sharper. I said hands where I can see them. Now, Alyssa's heartbeat quickened. She had been in situations like this before, but never on this side of the badge. Her experience told her to remain calm, to de-escalate the situation, but she could feel the tension radiating off Brian. The fear of what might happen if she didn't comply crept into her mind. Reluctantly, she raised her hands, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. "I'm telling you, officer, I'm Captain Turner," she said firmly. "My badge is in my purse." But Brian wasn't listening. He was already moving toward her, and before she could react, his hand was on her arm. With a swift, practiced motion, he spun her around and forced her hands behind her back, his grip rougher than necessary. The grocery bag fell from Alyssa's shoulder, its contents spilling across the sidewalk. Bread, vegetables, the bottle of wine she had picked up for dinner. The cold steel of the handcuffs clicked around Alyssa's wrists, and a surge of shock and anger shot through her. She couldn't believe what was happening. Her voice rose, firm and controlled, despite her growing frustration. "Officer, this is a mistake. I'm Captain Alyssa Turner. My badge is in my purse, for God's sake." But Brian was in full arrest mode, his tunnel vision blocking out anything that didn't fit the narrative he had built in his head. To him, this was a textbook arrest, one that would prove he was capable, that he could make a difference. He ignored the scattered groceries on the ground, ignored the building anger in Alyssa's voice, and led her toward the back of his squad car. As the cuffs dug into her wrists, Alyssa felt a wave of humiliation wash over her. How could this be happening? How could one of her own officers, someone who should have known better, be treating her like this? Her identity, her authority, everything she had worked for over the years, was being reduced to nothing in this moment. She was just another suspect in his eyes. The drive to the precinct felt surreal. Alyssa sat in the back of the squad car, her wrists still cuffed behind her, staring out the window as the city lights blurred past. She barely registered the faint wail of the sirens in the distance. Her mind raced, replaying the events over and over again. She had identified herself. She had told him who she was, but none of that had mattered. The weight of the situation began to sink in as the car pulled up to the station. The doors opened, and Brian led her inside, his grip still firm on her arm. The other officers at the precinct were going about their business, filing reports, answering calls, some chatting casually. But when they saw Brian leading Alyssa in, the air in the room shifted. The looks of confusion, shock, and disbelief were immediate. Alyssa, Captain Turner, was in handcuffs? No one dared say anything out loud, but the questions hung in the air, unspoken but heavy. Sergeant Lisa Collins, one of Alyssa's closest colleagues, was the first to break the silence. "Brian, what the hell is going on?" she demanded, her eyes wide with disbelief as she rushed over to the two of them. "Why is Captain Turner in handcuffs?" Brian paused, his confidence faltering for the first time. "She matched the description," he muttered, glancing around as if suddenly realizing the gravity of what he had done. "I thought she was the suspect." Lisa's expression hardened. "You didn't even check her ID?" "Brian, this is Captain Turner." The realization hit Brian like a punch to the gut. His face drained of color, and he quickly fumbled for the keys to the handcuffs, releasing Alyssa's wrists. The cuffs clattered to the floor, but the damage had already been done. Alyssa rubbed her sore wrists, her anger simmering just below the surface. She looked Brian in the eye, her voice cold and controlled. "You didn't listen. I told you who I was and you didn't listen." Brian stammered, his face flushed with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, Captain. I didn't realize." But Alyssa wasn't interested in his apology. She turned to Lisa, her voice steady but strained. "I need to speak to the chief. Now." As news of the arrest spread through the precinct, whispers and murmurs began to circulate. It didn't take long for word to leak to the public. By the next morning, the video of Alyssa's arrest, captured by a bystander, had gone viral. It was all over social media. A black woman handcuffed on the street, surrounded by groceries, being led away by a white officer. The headlines were explosive. "Police captain wrongfully arrested by her own officer." "Racial profiling in the police force." Again. The narrative had already been written in the eyes of the public, and protests began to form outside the precinct. Community leaders and activists took to the streets, demanding justice and accountability. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was tense. Officers who had once viewed Alyssa with respect now avoided eye contact. Some whispered in corners, unsure how to address the situation. Others simply acted like nothing had happened. But Alyssa felt the weight of it all pressing down on her. The job she had dedicated her life to, the department she had believed in, was now the source of her deepest humiliation. And as the protests outside grew louder, it became clear that this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about something much larger, something that had been festering beneath the surface for far too long. Alyssa sat in her office, staring at the closed door, her mind swirling with conflicting emotions. She had always been someone who maintained control, someone who kept her cool in even the most difficult situations. But now everything felt like it was slipping away. David had called earlier, his voice filled with concern. He had seen the video, of course, everyone had. He wanted to know how she was holding up, but Alyssa didn't have an answer for him. She didn't know how she was supposed to feel. She had spent years trying to reform the department from within, pushing for diversity training, advocating for community policing, and trying to build bridges between law enforcement and the people they serve. And now this. Alyssa leaned back in her chair, her hands covering her face as the exhaustion finally caught up with her. She had fought so hard to get where she was, to prove that she belonged. But in that moment, standing on the sidewalk in handcuffs, none of it had mattered. To Brian, she had just been another suspect, another black woman in the wrong place at the wrong time. Her phone buzzed on the desk, but she ignored it. She couldn't deal with anyone else right now. Not David, not Lisa, not the chief. All she wanted was to disappear for a while, to find a way to make sense of what had happened. But deep down, Alyssa knew that this wasn't something she could push aside. This was bigger than her. And as much as she wanted to retreat, to avoid the media frenzy and the protests outside, she couldn't, because if she didn't stand up and fight, who would? Later that afternoon, Alyssa stood in Chief Jack Monroe's office, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She could see the stress etched into Monroe's face as he sat behind his desk, his fingers steepled together. The chief was usually a composed man, but today he looked every bit as weary as Alyssa felt. "Alyssa," he began, sighing heavily, "I have nothing but respect for you. What happened out there?" He trailed off, rubbing his temples. "It's unacceptable, and trust me, we're going to handle this. But you need to understand the position I'm in." Alyssa's jaw tightened. She'd heard enough of these conversations over the years to know where it was headed. "The position you're in?" she echoed, her voice low but firm. "Jack, one of your officers put me in handcuffs. Me, his captain, and now I'm a public spectacle." Monroe's face flushed slightly. "I know, but the media is blowing this way out of proportion. The protests are happening for a reason," Alyssa interrupted, her frustration boiling over. "This isn't just about me, and you know it. This is about racial profiling, about bias in our department. And if you think I'm going to stay quiet about it, you're wrong." The tension in the room was palpable. Monroe leaned back in his chair, looking at Alyssa with a mixture of frustration and understanding. "What are you suggesting? You want to make a public statement? We're already under fire, Alyssa. The last thing we need is more fuel on the flames." Alyssa felt her hands clench into fists at her sides. She had spent her career trying to navigate the thin line between change and survival in this department. But this was different. This was personal, and the stakes were too high to ignore. "I want accountability," she said, her voice steady but hard. "This can't be swept under the rug, Jack. We need to address this head on, and it starts with Officer King." Monroe winced at the mention of Brian King. He knew this would be a delicate situation. "Brian's a good officer, Alyssa. He made a mistake, but he doesn't deserve to lose his career over it." Alyssa's eyes narrowed. "A good officer? He didn't listen, Jack. He didn't check my ID, didn't take a second to consider that maybe, just maybe, he had the wrong person. And if he can do that to me, what do you think he's doing to civilians every day?" Monroe was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the desk in front of him. He knew Alyssa was right, but the implications of what she was asking were enormous. The department was already under scrutiny, and if this escalated any further, it could damage the force's reputation beyond repair. "I'll launch an internal investigation," Monroe said finally, "but I need you to give me time, Alyssa. We can't afford to have this blow up any more than it already has." Alyssa took a deep breath, her anger simmering beneath the surface. You have your investigation, but don't expect me to stay silent. This department needs to change, Jack, and I'm going to make sure it does. The next day, Alyssa found herself standing in front of a podium, the flashing lights of cameras nearly blinding her as she prepared to make her public statement. The protests outside the precinct had swelled to hundreds of people, their chants for justice growing louder with each passing hour. The city was paying attention, and so was the media. Behind her, Mayor Catherine Lewis stood with a carefully neutral expression, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Alyssa knew the mayor was walking a political tightrope, trying to appease both the public and the police department. The city couldn't afford a scandal, but it also couldn't ignore the mounting anger from its citizens. Alyssa's heart pounded as she scanned the faces in the crowd. Journalists, activists, and community members all waited for her to speak. She could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on her, but she had already made her decision. She couldn't let fear dictate her actions anymore. She cleared her throat, her voice cutting through the low murmur of the crowd. "Thank you all for being here today," she began, her tone measured and calm. "What happened to me was not just a personal mistake. It was a reflection of a much deeper issue, one that has been present in law enforcement for far too long." The cameras clicked furiously as Alyssa continued, each word carefully chosen to convey her message without igniting further chaos. This is about more than one officer's actions. This is about the systemic issues that allowed those actions to occur. Racial bias, both conscious and unconscious, has been a problem in law enforcement for decades. And if we don't address it now, it will continue to undermine the trust between police officers and the communities we serve. Behind her, she could sense the mayor's discomfort, but Alyssa pressed on. "I've spent my career working to improve this department, to build bridges with our community, and to foster trust. But trust isn't something that's given, it's earned. And right now we have a lot of work to do to earn that trust back." Alyssa paused for a moment, her gaze sweeping across the crowd. "I'm calling for an independent investigation into the events that occurred. I'm calling for accountability, not just for the officer involved, but for the system that allowed it to happen. We need to do better. We can do better." As she finished, the crowd erupted into applause, and the media swarmed with questions. Alyssa held her ground, answering each question with poise and precision. But as the press conference went on, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The mayor finally stepped forward, her voice calm but slightly strained. "We fully support Captain Turner's call for an independent investigation. The city is committed to addressing these issues, and we will work closely with the department to ensure that changes are made." But Alyssa knew that words weren't enough. The real battle was just beginning. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Brian King sat in his apartment, staring blankly at the television screen. The news channels were playing the video of Alyssa's arrest on a loop, commentators dissecting every second of footage. The headline beneath the screen read, "Captain Alyssa Turner wrongfully arrested. Public outcry grows." Brian's stomach churned as he watched the footage, his heart sinking with every replay. He hadn't meant for any of this to happen. He had just been following the description, acting on his training. But now, as he sat there, replaying the events in his mind, he couldn't ignore the sinking feeling of guilt. He had been so sure of himself in that moment, so convinced that he was doing the right thing. But now, seeing the fallout, the protests, the anger, he wasn't sure of anything anymore. He hadn't just made a mistake. He had humiliated his own captain, someone who had dedicated her life to this department. Brian's phone buzzed on the table beside him, but he didn't reach for it. He couldn't face anyone right now, especially not his fellow officers. The station had become a pressure cooker, with everyone talking about the incident, whispering behind his back. Some supported him, saying it could have happened to anyone. Others weren't so kind, calling him reckless, questioning his judgment. The knock at his door startled him from his thoughts. For a moment, he considered ignoring it, but the knock came again, more insistent this time. Reluctantly, Brian stood and opened the door. Sergeant Lisa Collins stood on the other side, her face hard and unreadable. "Brian," she said, her voice low, "we need to talk." Brian stepped aside, letting her in. Lisa didn't waste any time. She turned to face him, arms crossed. "You messed up, right?" she asked, her tone blunt but not unkind. Brian nodded, his throat tight. "I know. Lisa sighed, rubbing her forehead. Look, I've known Alyssa for years. She's not just our captain. She's one of the best we have. And what you did, you need to own up to it. You need to take responsibility. Brian swallowed hard. I didn't mean to. I know you didn't, Lisa cut him off. But intentions don't matter. What matters is what you do now. Brian sat down on the couch, his head in his hands. I don't know what to do, Lisa. I don't know how to fix this. Lisa's voice softened slightly. You start by admitting you were wrong. You talk to Alyssa, and you listen to her, really listen. This is bigger than just you, Brian. It's about how we treat the people we're supposed to protect and how we treat each other. Brian looked up at her, his guilt etched across his face. He didn't know if an apology would ever be enough to undo what he'd done, but he knew he had to try. 2 weeks had passed since Alyssa's public statement, and the independent investigation was in full swing. External auditors were combing through every detail of the incident, and while the process was thorough, it was slow. For Alyssa, it felt like an eternity. The precinct was quieter than usual. Tension simmered beneath the surface. Officers went about their duties, but the usual banter and camaraderie had been replaced by an awkward silence. The internal investigation weighed heavily on Alyssa's mind. It wasn't just about the wrongful arrest anymore. The auditors were looking deeper into the culture of the department itself. Rumors were swirling about systemic issues being uncovered, reports of biased policing practices, and complaints that had gone unresolved for years. This wasn't just about one officer's actions. It was about the entire system. Alyssa sat in her office, staring at the piles of paperwork on her desk, but her mind was elsewhere. Every day brought new challenges. Every meeting with the auditors felt like reliving the arrest all over again. And yet, she knew this was necessary. If the department was to change, it had to start with uncovering the truth, no matter how uncomfortable that truth was. A knock on her door broke her from her thoughts. Sergeant Lisa Collins entered, her expression serious but sympathetic. How are you holding up? Lisa asked, sitting down across from Alyssa. Alyssa sighed, leaning back in her chair. I don't know, Lisa. This investigation, it's dredging up so much more than I expected. It's not just about Brian anymore. It's about the whole damn system. Lisa nodded, her face tight with understanding. I've been hearing the same. Some of the officers are getting nervous. They're worried about what's going to come out of this. They should be, Alyssa replied bluntly. We've been ignoring these problems for too long. Lisa hesitated for a moment before speaking again. You're doing the right thing, Alyssa, but it's not going to be easy. People don't like change, especially when it forces them to look in the mirror. Alyssa's expression hardened. I know, but I'm not backing down. This department has to change, and I'm going to make sure it does, even if that means taking on the entire system. As the days passed, Alyssa found herself confronting not just the system she worked within, but also her own internal struggles. For years, she had prided herself on her ability to navigate the complexities of law enforcement as a Black woman in a predominantly white, male-dominated department. She had always believed that change could come from within, that by working her way up the ranks, she could influence the department from the inside. But now, after everything that had happened, she wasn't so sure. The arrest had shaken her to her core, forcing her to question the very system she had dedicated her life to. She had been fighting for reform for years, pushing for bias training, for better community relations, for policies that would protect the vulnerable, but the events of the past few weeks had made her realize just how deeply entrenched the problems were. One evening, Alyssa sat at her kitchen table, a cup of tea growing cold in front of her. David was sitting across from her, his hands clasped together as he watched her carefully. You've been quiet lately, he said gently. Alyssa glanced up at him, offering a small, tired smile. I've been thinking a lot, about everything, about the department, about where I go from here. David reached across the table, taking her hand in his. You're strong, Alyssa, stronger than anyone I know, but you don't have to carry all of this on your own. Alyssa looked down at their joined hands, her mind swirling with conflicting thoughts. I just keep wondering if I've been going about this all wrong, she admitted. I've spent so much time trying to change the system from the inside, but maybe it's too broken to fix. David's grip on her hand tightened. Don't say that. You've made a difference, Alyssa. You've fought for change, and you've already started making it happen. But is it enough? Alyssa asked, her voice soft but filled with doubt. Is anything I do going to be enough? David's eyes softened as he looked at her. You've always believed in the power of change, in making things better. Don't lose that now. The department needs you. The community needs you. And I need you. Alyssa felt a lump form in her throat, but she swallowed it down, forcing herself to stay composed. I just feel like I'm being pulled in 1,000 different directions, she said quietly. The investigation, the media, the pressure from the department, it's all so much. David stood, moving around the table to kneel beside her. You're not alone in this. I'm here. Lisa's here. There are people who believe in you, Alyssa. You've got more support than you realize. Alyssa met his gaze, the weight of his words sinking in. He was right. She wasn't alone. And as overwhelming as everything felt, she knew she couldn't give up. Not now. Not when so much was at stake. I'm not giving up, she said, her voice stronger now. But I need to be smart about this. I need to figure out how to keep pushing forward without losing myself in the process. David smiled softly, pressing a kiss to her forehead. We'll figure it out together. The city council hearing was packed. Every seat in the chamber was filled, and a line of people stretched out the door, waiting to get in. Alyssa stood near the front of the room, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as she prepared to testify. This was it. The moment she had been building toward for weeks. The investigation had uncovered systemic flaws within the department, and now it was time for the city to decide what to do about it. The council members sat in a row at the front of the chamber, their expressions serious as they prepared to hear testimony from both sides. The mayor was there as well, seated next to Chief Monroe, her face a mask of careful neutrality. Alyssa knew that the mayor was walking a fine line, trying to balance the need for reform with the political realities of the situation. But Alyssa didn't care about politics. She cared about justice. As the room quieted, Alyssa stepped forward to the microphone. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she forced herself to stay calm, to stay focused. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today, she began, her voice steady. I'm here not just as a captain in the police department, but as someone who has experienced firsthand the consequences of systemic bias and injustice. The room was silent as Alyssa spoke, her words clear and unwavering. She recounted the events of her wrongful arrest, but she didn't dwell on the personal humiliation she had felt. Instead, she focused on the larger issue, the culture of bias that had allowed the incident to happen in the first place. This isn't just about one officer making a mistake, Alyssa continued. It's about a system that allows those mistakes to happen and a culture that perpetuates them. If we want to rebuild trust with our community, we need to start by addressing these issues head-on. We need to implement real, meaningful reforms, not just Band-Aid solutions that make us feel better in the short term. As she spoke, Alyssa could feel the eyes of the council members on her, their expressions thoughtful. She knew she was asking for a lot. The reforms she was proposing were sweeping: mandatory bias training, revised arrest protocols, and the establishment of an independent oversight committee. But she also knew that these changes were necessary. I'm not here to tear down the department, Alyssa said, her voice softening. I'm here because I believe in the good that we can do. But we can't do that good if we ignore the problems within our own ranks. When Alyssa finished, the room remained silent for a moment before the council members began to murmur among themselves. She had said what she needed to say. Now it was up to them. The decision from the city council came 2 days later. Alyssa sat in her office, her hands trembling slightly as she read the email outlining the council's approval of the proposed reforms. It wasn't everything she had hoped for. There had been compromises along the way, but it was a start. Brian King had been placed on suspension, pending further review, but he hadn't been fired. Alyssa wasn't sure how she felt about that. Part of her believed that Brian's actions warranted termination, but another part of her wondered if firing him would solve anything. The real problem was the culture of the department itself, and changing that would take more than just firing one officer. As she sat there, the weight of the past few weeks began to lift, ever so slightly. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in what felt like forever, Alyssa felt a sense of hope. She wasn't naive. She knew that implementing the reforms would be a long and difficult process. There would be resistance from within the department, and she would have to navigate the complexities of the political landscape. but she was ready for it. Alyssa stood and walked to the window, looking out over the city. The protests had quieted, but she could still feel the energy in the air, the desire for change, for justice. And as long as she had that, she knew she could keep fighting. The precinct buzzed with an unusual energy as the reforms were rolled out over the next several weeks. The training sessions, which focused on racial bias and new arrest protocols, were mandatory for every officer, regardless of rank. Alyssa sat in the back of one of the sessions, quietly observing. The trainer, a specialist brought in from an external agency, was going over case studies of biased policing practices, showing how unconscious bias could influence decisions on the street. Alyssa watched as some of the younger officers paid close attention, taking notes and asking thoughtful questions. But others, mostly older officers, sat with their arms crossed, looking skeptical or disengaged. She could feel the tension in the room, the resistance to change that had always been there, bubbling just below the surface. After the session ended, Sergeant Lisa Collins approached Alyssa, her expression unreadable. "What do you think?" Lisa asked, nodding toward the group of officers leaving the room. Alyssa shrugged, her eyes following the group. "Some of them are really trying, others, well, it's going to take time." Lisa sighed, folding her arms. "You know how it is. Change doesn't come easy, especially not in a place like this. But they'll get there. You've already done more than most ever have." Alyssa appreciated Lisa's words, but she knew this was only the beginning. The reforms were in place, but getting everyone on board was a different story. Many officers were resistant to the idea that they might have biases they weren't aware of. Others felt like the training was a punishment for something they didn't do. Alyssa understood their frustrations, but she also knew that this was the only way forward. "We're not just changing policy," Alyssa said, her voice firm. "We're changing the culture. That's what matters." Lisa nodded, her gaze softening. "And you're the one making it happen." A week later, Alyssa found herself standing outside Brian King's door. She had avoided this moment for as long as she could, but it was time. She needed to confront him, face to face, and try to make sense of everything that had happened between them. Brian had been placed on suspension, and his career was hanging by a thread. Alyssa had struggled with the decision to meet with him, but she knew it was necessary for both of them. She knocked, the sound echoing in the quiet hallway of his apartment building. A few moments later, the door opened, and Brian stood there, looking gaunt and exhausted. He had clearly been carrying the weight of his actions for weeks. "Captain," he said quietly, stepping aside to let her in. Alyssa entered the small apartment, her eyes scanning the modest living room. It was tidy but sparse, a reflection of someone who spent more time at work than at home. Brian gestured for her to sit, and she did, but not before noticing the tension in his body. He seemed nervous, uncertain of how this conversation would go. "I wasn't sure if you'd come," Brian said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know I messed up, and I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted to apologize, properly." Alyssa nodded, taking a deep breath. "I appreciate that, Brian, but this isn't just about an apology. We need to talk about what happened and why." Brian looked down at his hands, which were clasped tightly in his lap. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I was following the description, and everything in me told me that I had the right person. But I didn't stop to think. I didn't listen to you. And now, I've ruined everything." Alyssa leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but firm. "You didn't ruin everything, Brian, but you made a serious mistake. And it's a mistake that could have cost someone their life if the situation had been different. You need to understand that this wasn't just about misidentifying me. It's about the way you approached the situation. You saw a black woman, and your instincts told you she was guilty. You didn't question it. That's the problem." Brian's face paled, and he nodded slowly. "I know, and I've been thinking about it every day since. I keep wondering if I'm really cut out for this job, if maybe I'm not the kind of cop I thought I was." Alyssa softened, her tone gentler now. "Brian, this job isn't easy. We all make mistakes, but it's how we learn from them that matters. This department is changing, and you have a choice to make. You can either be part of that change, or you can walk away." Brian's eyes met hers, filled with a mix of regret and resolve. "I don't want to walk away. I want to be better. I want to fix this. Alyssa nodded, standing up to leave. Then start by listening to the people you serve, to your colleagues, and most importantly, to yourself. As she turned to leave, Brian called after her. Thank you, Captain, for giving me another chance. Alyssa paused at the door, her back to him. Just don't waste it, Brian. With the department slowly adapting to the new reforms, Alyssa found herself in a strange place. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of hope. Things were moving in the right direction, even if it was slow and painful. But with that progress came another realization. She had neglected her personal life for too long. One evening, Alyssa came home to find David sitting at the dining table, working on his laptop. He looked up as she walked in, offering her a tired smile. Hey, he said softly, standing to greet her with a hug. How was your day? Alyssa sighed as she leaned into his embrace. Exhausting, but good. The reforms are finally starting to take shape. People are talking. Change is happening. David smiled, though Alyssa could sense a hint of weariness behind it. I'm proud of you, Alyssa, but you know you don't have to carry this burden alone. Alyssa looked up at him, her expression softening. I know, and I've been thinking about that. I've been so focused on work, on making things right, that I haven't been here. For you. For us. David's arms tightened around her. We've been through a lot, Alyssa, but we'll get through this too. You're doing something important, but don't forget, you're important too. I need you. Alyssa felt a lump rise in her throat. She had been so consumed with the fight for justice, for change, that she had pushed aside the things that mattered most in her personal life. But now, standing here in David's arms, she realized that balance was possible. I'm sorry, she whispered. I haven't been the partner you deserve. David kissed her forehead, his voice soft and reassuring. You're doing the best you can, Alyssa, and that's all I need. Just don't forget to take care of yourself along the way. Alyssa nodded, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. She wasn't in this fight alone. She had David, Lisa, and a team of people who believed in her. And as overwhelming as the journey had been, she knew she was on the right path. That night, Alyssa and David sat down together for the first time in weeks. They talked about everything, the challenges, the victories, and the moments of doubt. But most importantly, they talked about the future. It was a future filled with uncertainty, but also with hope. Months passed, and the department continued to adapt to the changes Alyssa had fought so hard for. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, moments of resistance, and plenty of challenges along the way. But little by little, progress was made. Alyssa became a leading voice in the department, not just for reform, but for bridging the divide between the police and the community. She organized community meetings, bringing officers and civilians together to talk openly about their experiences, their fears, and their hopes. It was hard work, but it was worth it. One afternoon, Alyssa stood on the steps of the precinct, looking out at the street. The protests had died down, and the tension that had gripped the city for so long had eased. But she knew the fight wasn't over. There was still so much work to be done. Lisa approached her from behind, her voice light but sincere. You've done something amazing here, Alyssa. Alyssa smiled, glancing over at her friend. We've done something amazing. I couldn't have done it without you. Lisa grinned, crossing her arms. Well, don't think you're off the hook. There's still plenty of work to do. Alyssa laughed, her heart feeling lighter than it had in months. I wouldn't have it any other way. As the sun set behind the precinct, casting long shadows across the street, Alyssa felt a renewed sense of purpose. The journey had been long and difficult, but it wasn't over. There would always be challenges, always more to fight for. But for the first time in a long time, Alyssa felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She was ready for whatever came next. A year had passed since the events that changed Alyssa's life in the department forever. The reforms had taken root, and while the process of change was slow, it was steady. The department had become a model for other cities, showing how real reform could be achieved through persistence, accountability, and a willingness to face uncomfortable truths. Alyssa sat in her office, a framed commendation on the wall behind her, a symbol of the work she had done, but also a reminder of how much more there was left to do. She smiled to herself as she thought about the future, about the new recruits who were coming into the department with fresh eyes and open minds. As she stood and walked toward the door, Alyssa paused for a moment, taking in the view outside her window. The city was alive with possibility, and so was she. Alyssa Turner wasn't just a captain. She was a leader, a fighter, and a force for change. And no matter how difficult the road ahead might be, she knew one thing for certain. She would never stop fighting for justice. And with that thought, Alyssa stepped out of her office, ready for whatever came next. If you enjoyed this story and found it as thrilling and captivating as I did, please consider hitting that subscribe button to stay updated with more incredible tales like this one. By subscribing, you'll never miss out on any new stories, and you'll be the first to experience the twists and turns of every adventure. Don't forget to turn on notifications by clicking the bell icon so you're always in the loop when new content drops. Your support truly helps this channel grow and allows me to continue creating stories that inspire, entertain, and connect us all. Thanks for being a part of this journey. Join our community and let's continue exploring together.